Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's special Last Post ceremony. My name is Craig Burrell, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Warrant Officer Nikolai Rofe. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria, and RSL Queensland. We would also like to take a moment to consider and pay respect to the many professional and volunteer firefighters who are out in the thick of the bushfires, working in the most challenging and dangerous of conditions to keep people, places, and communities safe. We thank you for your commitment and service, which reflects the essence of the Australian spirit, a spirit that we also showcase here in the stories at the Australian War Memorial. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could come to mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the hearts of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. Following the reading of the story of Private James Alfred Smith, a single wreath will be laid in commemoration.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private James Alfred Smith. James Alfred Smith was born in 1899 to Charles and Anne Smith of Moree, northern New South Wales. He attended school in a town and worked as a drover in the district. In March 1916, despite being underage, Smith volunteered to enlist in the Australian Imperial Force. He told the recruiting officer that he was 18. After a brief period of training in Australia, he sailed from Sydney on board the transport ship Marathon in May 1916. Smith arrived in England in July 1916 and continued his training at the Army camp at the Salisbury Plain. The camp suffered from overcrowding and unhealthy conditions, and it appeared that Smith picked up an illness while training. After his arrival in France in September, he was admitted to hospital, where he remained for about 3 weeks. In October, he joined his units in the field, the 53rd Australian Infantry Battalion. By the end of 1916, British and Allied forces had captured a series of strategic points north of the Somme River between the towns of Albert and Beaumont. As a harsh winter set in, the British and German forces began fortifying their new positions. The 53rd Battalion moved to the front lines in this region in late January 1917. A few days after this, Smith was struck by shell fragments in his chest and badly wounded. He was evacuated to England, where he recovered in hospital for 2 months. He continued training in England until the end of the year, returning to his unit in France in October 1917. The 53rd Battalion played a supporting role in the Third Battle of Ypres. Many of its men carried rations and supplies to the Australian units in the front line under shell fire through deep mud and heavy rain. The Australian involvement in the battle ended in mid-October, and from then until March 1918, Smith's battalion remained in Belgium. Over the winter months, they spent time training and in the front lines. In mid-March 1918, German forces launched what was to be their last major assault of the war. Known as the German Spring Offensive, it aimed to capture the important rail hub city of Amiens many Australian units were rushed south from Belgium to the Somme River sector. The 53rd Battalion took up position in a supporting role west of the town of Albert. In early April, the battalion moved to the front lines near Amiens. After some days on the front, the unit moved back to the reserve area where Smith was struck in the back by shell fragments. He was taken to the nearest casualty station but died of his wounds on 11th of April 1918. He was 18 years old. James Smith was buried in Namur British Cemetery with more than 400 Commonwealth French soldiers. His father chose the inscription, "The Lord gave and the Lord have taken away." In 1919, Smith's parents wrote to the Australian military authorities asking where his personal belongings would be sent to them. In fact, his effects had already been sent home, bound for Australia on the steamship Barunga when the ship was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Cornwall in July 1918. British ships were soon on the scene and managed to rescue all on board, but the personal effects of Smith and about 5,000 other Australian soldiers who had died on the Western Front were lost. Smith's uncle, Private Albert Alexander Smith, served in the 2nd Battalion and was wounded near Amiens on the day that James died. Robert died of his wounds 2 days later and was buried in the same cemetery as his nephew. The names of Private James Albert Smith and his uncle, Private Robert Alexander Smith, are listed on the Roll of Honour among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. This is but one of many of the stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private James Albert Smith, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand and remove hats for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Lest we forget.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the last post ceremony. Tonight, our piper will play a lament for you, Flowers of the Forest, as you leave Anzac Hall. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial, and we wish you all a very good evening.